When South Sudan became the world's newest nation in 2011, the world celebrated. After decades of war with the North, a long-suffering people had finally gained independence. Flags rose, anthems played, and the hopes of millions filled the air like dawn breaking after a long night. The international community called it a triumph of self-determination. The United Nations welcomed the 193rd member state. For many, South Sudan symbolized the idea that peace, after decades of struggle, was possible. But beneath the joy lay fragility. Independence had come not at the end of prosperity, but after generations of destruction. Entire regions had been depopulated. Infrastructure was minimal. Education levels were among the lowest in the world. The new government inherited not a state, but the wreckage of one. The first months were euphoric. Oil exports surged, and Juba, the capital, began to grow rapidly. Hotels filled with investors, diplomats, and journalists. Yet the foundations were unstable. 98% of government revenue came from oil, and almost all of that flowed through pipelines controlled by Sudan, the very country South Sudan had broken away from. Independence had given political freedom, but not economic autonomy. When negotiations over transit fees collapsed, Khartoum shut the pipeline. In one move, South Sudan's government lost almost all of its income. Salaries went unpaid, projects halted, and inflation soared. The young state discovered that sovereignty without infrastructure is like a flag without wind, symbolic but powerless. At the same time, ethnic divisions deepened. The two largest groups, the Dinka and the Nuer, had fought side by side during the independence struggle, but the unity of war dissolved in peace. Old rivalries reemerged. The promise of democracy turned into competition for power and resources. President Salva Kiir, a Dinka, and his then-deputy Riek Machar, a Nuer, embodied this fragile balance. Both were veterans of the Liberation War, both commanded loyalty among their own ethnic bases, and both distrusted each other. The cabinet meetings that were meant to chart a national future became battlegrounds of suspicion. In 2013, barely 2 years after independence, the tension erupted. Factions within the Presidential Guard clashed in Juba. Within days, the violence spread across the country. The rhetoric of politics turned into the logic of war. Soldiers turned on neighbors, communities split, and massacres followed. The dreams of 2011 collapsed into the nightmare of 2013. The conflict quickly assumed ethnic overtones, Dinka against Nuer, government against rebels, each side convinced it fought for survival. Yet beneath the surface, this was not only a tribal war, it was a struggle over the very architecture of the state. Who would control the oil? Who would command the army? Who would define what South Sudan was meant to be? The Civil War shattered every fragile institution that had begun to form. Schools closed, hospitals were looted, and roads became front lines. Millions fled their homes. Hundreds of thousands crossed into Uganda, Sudan, and Ethiopia. The United Nations declared it one of the fastest-growing humanitarian crises on Earth. Oil, once the engine of hope, became the engine of destruction. Both sides sought to seize oil fields to finance their operations. Fields were burned, pipelines sabotaged, production plummeted. The economy imploded and famine followed. By 2016, Juba itself became a war zone. The capital that had once hosted embassies and investors now echoed with gunfire. Foreign nationals were evacuated. Peacekeepers struggled to maintain order. The government fractured and rival factions multiplied. For the ordinary South Sudanese, survival replaced politics. Food prices soared. Wages vanished. Children were born into camps instead of classrooms. The dream of independence had turned into a geography of displacement. Camps scattered across borders, each filled with faces that had once celebrated freedom. The question for analysts and citizens alike became, how did it go so wrong, so fast? Part of the answer lies in history. The Sudanese civil wars, first from 1955 to 1972, then from 1983 to 2005, had left deep scars. Entire generations knew little except war. Command structures, not civic institutions, governed daily life. When peace arrived, Those command structures became political structures. The state was built around ex-generals rather than administrators, around loyalty rather than merit. The international community, eager to celebrate independence, underestimated the challenge of nation-building. Billions in aid flowed into Juba, but little of it built enduring systems. Donors assumed that elections and oil revenue would naturally lead to stability. They did not. South Sudan became, in effect, a rentier state without the institutions to manage rent. Oil money created a fragile prosperity, but it also deepened patronage networks. Power meant access to oil contracts. Losing power meant losing everything. In such an environment, politics becomes existential and negotiation nearly impossible. When oil prices crashed globally in 2014, the consequences were devastating. The government printed money to pay soldiers. Inflation spiraled into triple digits. The local currency collapsed. Basic goods became unaffordable. Teachers and civil servants left their posts. A generation of children grew up without schools, vaccines, or security. Humanitarian agencies rushed in, but even aid became politicized. Some convoys were looted, others were blocked. Both government and rebels used hunger as leverage. In 2017, famine was officially declared in parts of Unity State. For many South Sudanese, it was the ultimate betrayal to survive decades of war for independence, only to starve in freedom. Yet amid the tragedy, resilience persisted. Communities rebuilt what they could. Local leaders organized ceasefires. Churches, NGOs, and elders tried to mediate peace. The regional body IGAD, with backing from the African Union, brokered multiple agreements. Each brought brief calm, then renewed fighting. Trust had eroded too deeply. By 2018, another peace deal was signed. This one, more inclusive, reinstated Riek Machar as vice president and called for a unity government. For a moment, optimism returned. Oil output inched upward. Refugees began to trickle home, but governance remained weak. The unity government functioned more as a truce than as a shared vision. Ministries were divided like spoils. Corruption flourished. The revenues that might have built roads or schools vanished into private accounts. Transparency International ranked South Sudan among the most corrupt countries in the world. Meanwhile, local conflicts over cattle, land, and resources continued to erupt, often armed by national factions seeking influence. The state that had once promised inclusion became a mosaic of competing armed groups. Each province functioned almost autonomously, some under warlords, others under army generals. The monopoly on violence, the defining feature of any state, no longer existed, and yet the international community could not abandon South Sudan. Too much had been invested, politically, financially, morally. Peacekeepers remained. Humanitarian flights continued. The country survived, but only barely. By the early 2020s, climate shocks compounded the crisis. Floods displaced hundreds of thousands. Crops failed. Oil fields, already damaged, faced new challenges from environmental degradation. The government, still dependent on oil for nearly all revenue, had little capacity to diversify. The paradox of South Sudan deepened. Immense natural wealth alongside extreme poverty. The Nile flowed with potential, fertile land, livestock, and minerals. Yet the people remained trapped in cycles of dependency and displacement. The collapse of South Sudan was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, a combination of weak institutions, ethnic mistrust, economic dependence, and international miscalculation. It was the story of a nation born too quickly into a world too complex, without the anchors of history's older states. And still, the possibility of renewal exists. Every crisis holds within it the seeds of reconstruction. South Sudan's youth, the majority of its population, have grown up knowing only instability, yet they also carry the hunger for peace more deeply than any generation before them. Civil society, though fragile, is active. Churches and local groups continue to mediate, educate, and rebuild. If the first decade of independence was defined by conflict, the next could be defined by learning. When observers look at South Sudan from above, they see a vast fertile land divided by rivers and swamps, bordered by 6 nations, rich in oil, cattle, and promise. Yet every advantage has turned into a dilemma. Geography has made the country both strategic and fragile. Its borders touch Sudan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, the Congo, and the Central African Republic, each with its own conflicts, ambitions, and interests. The region's security and economies intertwine like the Nile's branches. Sudan, the former parent state, remains both neighbor and rival. The unresolved issues of border demarcation, oil revenue sharing, and the contested Abyei region continue to poison relations. Juba depends on Khartoum's pipeline to export its crude. Khartoum depends on transit fees to stabilize its own budget. Neither can afford a total break, yet mistrust defines every negotiation. To the south, Uganda has played a dual role, a mediator and a power broker. Kampala's troops intervened in 2013 to support the government in Juba, preventing an outright military collapse, but also deepening perceptions of foreign alignment. Kenya and Ethiopia, key members of the regional bloc IGUSD, oscillate between diplomacy and self-interest. Each sees South Sudan as both a market and a potential corridor for trade. This network of competing external actors means that every internal faction in South Sudan can find external sympathy. The result is a web of alliances that keeps peace fragile and war always possible. The country's sovereignty is thus constantly negotiated, not only within its borders, but around conference tables in Addis Ababa, Nairobi, and Khartoum. Inside the country, the challenge of governance remains overwhelming. Ministries exist, but their capacity is thin. Many local officials lack formal training. Civil servants often go unpaid for months. The military budget still absorbs the largest share of national expenditure, while health and education fight for scraps. The logic of war, secrecy, command, and loyalty still dominates a system that was meant to transition toward openness and accountability. Yet it would be misleading to reduce South Sudan to despair alone. Beneath the visible failures lies a social fabric that, though torn, refuses to disintegrate. Communities continue to organize around chiefs, churches, and women's groups. Local peace committees in Jonglei, Lakes, and Warrap have negotiated ceasefires that national politicians could not. These are fragile but real forms of governance emerging from below. The international community faces its own paradox. Billions of dollars in aid have kept people alive, but they have also created dependency. Humanitarian agencies sometimes perform the duties of a state, feeding, schooling, healing, without being able to build one. When donors withdraw, gaps reappear overnight. For many South Sudanese, the face of authority is not their government, but the logos of NGOs and UN agencies painted on sacks of grain. Peacekeeping, too, has its limits. The United Nations mission in South Sudan, or UNMISS, has protected hundreds of thousands in its camps, yet it cannot impose political reconciliation. It is a shield, not a solution. Its presence saves lives, but also allows leaders to delay difficult compromises. Knowing that the world will not let the country collapse completely economically, the state remains trapped in a single commodity model. Oil still provides more than 90% of revenue, yet production has never returned to pre-war levels. Fields damaged during fighting require costly rehabilitation. Pipelines leak. Foreign companies hesitate to invest. Corruption siphons off what little income remains. Public accounts are opaque, and auditing mechanisms are weak. At the same time, the population has continued to grow rapidly, surpassing 11 million. Youth unemployment is near total. For many, the only employer is the army or an armed group. This militarized economy reinforces the cycle of violence. Guns bring income, while peace offers few alternatives. Climate change now amplifies every weakness. In recent years, unprecedented floods have submerged entire counties, wiping out crops and isolating villages. Nomadic routes have shifted, igniting clashes between herders and farmers. Cattle raids, once seasonal, have become year-round conflicts. In parts of the country, entire communities now live on islands of mud, dependent on airdrops for survival. The environmental catastrophe feeds the humanitarian one. More than 2 million people remain internally displaced, and another 2 million live as refugees in neighboring countries. Whole generations have grown up in camps, educated by aid workers rather than national teachers. For these children, home is an abstract word, and the idea of nationhood is fragile. Still, seeds of progress exist. The revitalized peace agreement of 2018, though fragile, has reduced large-scale battles. Roads built by the UN and regional partners have begun to reconnect markets. A few entrepreneurs have started small factories in Juba and Wau. Agricultural cooperatives have revived in parts of the Equatorias. The reopening of schools after years of closure has created a sense of normalcy in some towns. Civil society groups and journalists, often operating under risk, continue to push for transparency. They document abuses, report on missing funds, and remind leaders that the world is still watching. Churches remain among the most trusted institutions, mediating disputes that governments cannot. Women's organizations in particular have played vital roles in reconciliation, organizing dialogues between rival communities and caring for survivors of violence. Yet progress remains fragile because the political system itself has not fundamentally changed. The unity government functions as a coalition of armed movements rather than a single vision of statehood. Disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, the three pillars of post-conflict recovery, move slowly. Soldiers who disarm risk unemployment. Those who keep their weapons maintain leverage. The result is a country half at peace and half at war. The challenge now is existential. Can South Sudan transform from a liberation movement into a modern state? This transformation demands more than ceasefires. It requires an entirely different mindset, one that replaces personal loyalty with institutional legitimacy and that views power as service rather than survival. Some efforts point in that direction. The government has begun working with the African Union to draft a new constitution. The process is slow and often contested, but it provides a platform for national dialogue. Young professionals, many educated abroad, are returning to contribute to administration and planning. Digital initiatives are emerging to improve tax collection and reduce corruption. These are small, cautious steps, but they matter. Regionally, there is growing awareness that South Sudan's stability is not optional. Uganda relies on its trade routes through Juba. Kenya views the country as part of its economic corridor to the interior. Ethiopia and Sudan understand that renewed war would send refugees across their borders. This convergence of interests gives the region a collective incentive to sustain peace. The broader lesson of South Sudan extends beyond its borders. It reveals the limits of state building driven by external timelines. Independence, elections, and recognition are milestones, not destinations. Real sovereignty requires institutions that can mediate conflict, collect revenue, deliver justice, and provide services. Without these, independence becomes a flag over fragility. For scholars of development, South Sudan stands as both a tragedy and a warning. It shows how natural wealth without governance can deepen rather than relieve suffering. It shows how liberation movements, when untransformed, can reproduce the same authoritarian habits they once fought against. And it shows how international aid, if misaligned with local realities, can sustain survival without enabling progress. But it also shows something else: the endurance of hope. Even after everything, surveys and interviews reveal that most South Sudanese still believe in the idea of their nation. They want peace, not revenge, opportunity, not charity. They still speak proudly of Independence Day, not as a failure, but as an unfinished beginning. The future of South Sudan will depend on whether its leaders can match that faith. The oil will eventually run out. Donor fatigue will deepen. The world's attention will move elsewhere. What will remain are the people and the institutions they build. If those institutions can grow stronger than the divisions that birthed them, then South Sudan can still surprise history. It can become not a cautionary tale, but a case study in recovery. The same rivers that carried refugees can carry trade. The same soldiers who fought each other can rebuild roads. The same land that drowned in floods can, with the right planning, feed the region. That transformation will not happen through declarations or summits alone. It will happen through patient governance, through a teacher returning to a reopened school, a doctor staying in a rural clinic, a farmer planting again despite the risk of flood or drought. It will happen when loyalty shifts from tribe to institution, from personality to principle. In the end, the story of South Sudan is still being written. The chapters of war and hunger are not the whole book. Every day, somewhere in that vast land, someone is still choosing to rebuild rather than to flee. Perhaps that, more than anything, is the measure of a nation's resilience, not the absence of collapse, but the refusal to accept it as final.